we'll start with Daniel Immerwahr, history professor, who has a piece in the New Yorker this week about Venezuela. And he wrote of Robert Gates, the Republican former Secretary of Defense, who was kept on by Obama, you may remember, about the collective approach to US influence abroad and as a symphony of power. And Daniel writes, forget the symphony of power. Trump just wants to crash the cymbals. So, Daniel.
Hi. So it's a little unclear as a historian what to make of unfurling chaos, but I think the big historical object to keep in view is the thing we have some different names for, US hegemony, Pax Americana, but it is the post-1945 notion that the role of the United States is to police or superintend global affairs. And defenders of this call it the liberal international order, and they not only think it's a good thing, but they ultimately regard the United States as an umpire, calling the fair and foul, and backing that up with force, guaranteeing fair play. And then they point out that a game without an umpire would be anarchy. And then they often say that a game with a different umpire, Russia, China, would be a catastrophe of a different kind. I am a critic of hegemony, US hegemony, Pax Americana, and critics from the left, like myself, are less likely to call it umpire than to call it empire. And we often point out that it's neither as benevolent or as beneficent as it claims to be, and then we emphasize the cost to the world. And then there's usually this kind of litany of things that we have suspicions about, which include trade deals, aid, the foreign policy consensus, the US policing of the planet. And I just mentioned this list because Donald Trump is also critical of all of those things. I think it is important to see Trump as a right-wing anti-hegemonist. So he sometimes weirdly overlaps with the left, but he has a different core objection, which is not that Pax Americana is too costly for the planet, but that Pax Americana is too costly for the United States. My own sense is that Trump's consciousness around this was formed in the 1980s with regard to Japan. So after World War II, the United States, a war in which the United States had napalmed and nuked Japan, it then invested a lot of energy into rebuilding the Japanese economy on the understanding that this would be a sort of reliable partner in a capitalist system. So if you're going to make the case for the far-seeing capacity of Pax Americana, Japan would be a good thing to point to. Trump, however, has never seen it that way. He came of sort of political age in the 1980s when it seemed like Japan had done so well that Japanese investors were snapping up a lot of real estate in Manhattan, and Trump was sort of trying to buy some of it back. There was this moment in the 80s when it seemed like Trump was the great white hope against this economic Pearl Harbor. And I think he's maintained that vision ever since. He's been extraordinarily suspicious throughout his entire career that there is any upshot for the United States in maintaining any kind of sort of global system. It was a really striking moment in his first year of his first term when some of the quote unquote adults in the room, like Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, Jim Mattis, who was Secretary of Defense, brought him into the Pentagon and just laid out the whole thing for him. They were like, this is where we have all our military bases. This is where we have all our deals. And it's this kind of moment where past presidents who've had that slideshow have walked away saying, you know, I see the light. We can't give up any of this. And by all accounts, Trump spent the entire time scowling, saying, why are we doing that? This is stupid. And at the end saying, all of this is what I don't want. And this was the meeting that impelled Rex Tillerson to reportedly say that Trump was a fucking moron. In saying that Trump is an anti-hegemonist, I don't want to say that he's an isolationist. He is quite obviously not. But it's just to say that he casts around for different models for how US power might be projected. And distinctively, a lot of his models are pre-1945. So he's interested in the founders, he's interested in the Monroe Doctrine. He has this thing for William McKinley, who was president in the 1890s, and he draws a lot of inspiration from the America First movement. There are important continuities between Trump's vision of world affairs and foreign relations and Pax Americana, the idea that the United States would invade a Latin American country and abduct a dictator. That's not new. That happened in 1989 in the invasion of Panama. But there are even there some new parts of it. Usually US action has been wrapped in a kind of explanation of why this is consistent with the norms that the United States seeks to uphold. And Trump seems completely uninterested in making that case. Very quickly into his press conference, he started with the legal case against Maduro, which was a thin pretext, and then immediately just unbidden started talking about oil. You can regard Trump as offering a kind of welcome candor, but you could also see this candor as an attack on norms, no longer even paying lip service to principles and no longer doing things that arguably past presidents had done, which is even as they're seeking to have an exception for themselves, they're trying to kind of reinscribe the norm as, in this case, the norm against invasion as something that is generally not done. Trump's foreign policy is also interestingly narrower than liberal internationalism. If, as the 9/11 Commission report famously put it, they saw it as the American homeland is the planet. Trump thinks hemispherically. He thinks in terms of particular places. He doesn't seem to have a kind of system in mind. But also Trump's understanding of what the United States might do to pursue its narrow interest is much broader. A thing that Trump has been really loud about is not just his desire to run Venezuela, but to annex Greenland, something I take quite seriously, whether or not it happens. We sometimes say the cliche about Trump is that he says the quiet part out loud. And when it comes to oil, I think you could make that case. But when it comes to permanently annexing foreign territories to the United States, and that is something that has been in the repertoire of US power in the past. But that's something that I think recent presidents not just have wanted, but known not to say out loud. I think that's something that US presidents haven't wanted. So we are in a kind of playing by a different rule book. I am open-minded enough to wonder if the recession of US dominance might lead to some good things as well as bad, more chaos, but perhaps also more democracy. But I'm also obviously deeply concerned by the way that recent events have pointed and fear that Pax Americana may end not with a whimper, but with a bang. Thank you.
Let me go and ask a quick question first, so that we're not just going directly down the line one after another. On this issue of chaos, he likes to say that he is unpredictable. That's his strategy. And of course, he's bombed or rained missiles on 7 countries so far. How does that fit into America First and any kind of coherent policy?
Yeah, so if you regard America First as we'll keep our hands to ourselves, as I think some of his voters have regarded it, but it is consistent with the kind of power that Trump wants to wield. I think the type of power to which he's most drawn is the power of the bully, which works well with arbitrary attacks. You lash out at a few targets, it's not systematic, and that produces just produces a generalized fear. You could regard this as potentially good for the United States. Other countries fear it if you're playing that game. But you have to think about the effect on the world. This is deeply destabilizing because it forces countries to either supplicate to Trump out of direct fear, but if they do that, leaders almost always have problems with their bases. So they kind of destabilize themselves domestically, or they render themselves, prone to getting abducted.
The power of the bully. That sounds like a useful phrase to sum it all up. So next we have Ana Arjona, who is an associate professor in political science and the co-editor of Perspectives on Politics.
Thank you. As I was thinking about, what could be said in 5 minutes, which is not a lot of time for such an important event or a series of events, I thought of emphasizing 2 that may seem disconnected, but I think they are in some way connected. So the first one is thinking about drug trafficking in Latin America, which was invoked as the main reason for this operation or attack. As you have probably seen in the news, this really just doesn't line up with the facts. And I don't know that the American public is aware how really opposed to the facts this is. So I wanted to clarify 2 things. So the first one is the epidemic crisis with drugs in the US has been linked, of course, to fentanyl. There has never been a report or data that suggests that fentanyl comes from Venezuela or from South America in general. If we think about cocaine, because then you could say, well, it's not fentanyl, it's cocaine. Yes, Venezuela is a corridor through which cocaine is trafficked, but mostly to Europe. Most of the cocaine that comes to the US is trafficked through other regions. Venezuela does not grow the coca plant. It does process some of the coca leaves that are produced in other countries, but the cocaine that is fabricated there or processed there does not go to the US, and that has been said by the UN office that is in charge of analyzing and collecting data on drug production and trafficking, and it has been said by the DEA. So the facts just really don't justify at all the attacks. There is no way, there is no possible logic whereby by attacking Venezuela or removing Maduro or the entire regime would change the inflow of cocaine into the US based on everything we know. So I wanted to make that point. What could be the effect of these attacks on drug trafficking in Latin America? Based on what we know, these organizations that move drugs around adapt very quickly. When there are higher costs of going through a country, they just move to another country. That movement to another country or to try to get control over trafficking routes that rival organizations have usually leads to more violence. So if anything, this could push these organizations to work or look for routes in other countries that are not as impacted yet, to strengthen routes that exist in other places, or to escalate violence. So what is the real effect in Latin America, even if violence is not going up? And here I think I'm going to echo some of the things that Daniel said. I think that for me, the most problematic consequences of all of this for Latin America and for the world is this very explicit abandonment of international norms, even as an aspiration. So of course, the international norms and international law for respecting the sovereignty of other countries, for the defense of human rights, have not been followed by many countries all the time. The US is one of them, right? So of course, there have been violations all the time. But, and you mentioned this, in every single case of a violation, there was at least the effort, which is hypocrisy, but the effort of explaining that decision and that violation in a way that justified it, that made it not a violation. And what that communicated to the world was, we still believe in these norms as aspirations. We assume and we understand that we should abide by these laws, by these norms. And in this case, we're doing so, even if that required very complicated stories that many people didn't believe. Here, what we saw, and I think especially with Stephen Miller's interview that probably you have read about, who openly said that these laws, these norms are niceties, and the iron law of throughout history is that the strong powers do whatever they want because they have the capacity to do that. I think that is a very real change. I think it sends a message that changes the calculations of risks and costs and obstacles for powerful countries around the world when they think of annexing territories or they think about intervening in other countries or committing human rights abuses. And I think for Latin America, this is a very clear signal that they are just really unsafe. Yes, they were always open to interventions, influence, pressure, but this has put sort of in a very clear way that there is not even going to be the pretense of following these norms, of the US being part of a collective that has tried to push for these norms internationally. So I think words matter. In this case, I think norms, international norms, operates at many levels. It's not just when we have the enforcement capacity to really make sure that the laws are followed. Of course, that has failed many times. But when we share these norms as aspirations, it shapes the behavior of leaders and it shapes the expectations of countries. So I think this is a very, very radical change in international relations and our ability to form expectations about what other countries may do.
Why would you say that this sort of avoidance of norms or rejection of norms matters in terms of US influence abroad?
I think it matters because it creates a very strong precedent, both for the US and for other countries. So it makes it easier. So I think if we could somehow capture how slowly the American public gets used to a new way of doing foreign policy, this is going to make it so much easier for future administrations to just do what they want, use their power, because that's what military might allows you to do, right? And that again, it reduces the costs and the obstacles for making these kinds of decisions that, of course, every single country is tempted to do when it can just get a big reward or a big prize, right? And in terms of other countries, it's really sending a signal to any country that has the ability to violate some of these norms and get something out of it, that the expectation is not anymore that they should comply with these norms. And there used to be some consequences sometimes, economic sanctions, political shaming, there were some consequences. When the collective understanding of that norm changes, I think the incentives for countries and the expectations of their populations and their voters change as well.
So just breaking down the architecture and the understandings of the international collective, sending a signal to maybe Beijing and Moscow and elsewhere and authoritarians. Thanks for that. That's great. So next we will turn to Lena Brito, history professor, who will be talking about your own experience also as a journalist, from what you have done.
Thanks. So I just love kind of like the contrast in this conversation, because so far my colleagues have talked about what is new, and I happen to agree with everything you just said. But I'm going to talk about what is old and what hasn't changed and what is not really new. Because I'm a historian of modern Latin America, but what I do is research on the history of drug trafficking and the drug wars in Latin America and the Caribbean. And actually the region that I happen to know a lot about is just next to Venezuela, the farther west-east side of Colombia on the border with Venezuela, where actually some of these so-called drug boats were washed ashore recently, and actually the New York Times reported about that with fantastic photographic work about these evidences as well. So as a historian of drug trafficking and the drug wars in Latin America and the Caribbean, I was not surprised to see the Trump administration using the strategy of the war on drugs to prepare the soil for regime change in Venezuela. Because the war on drugs, since its inception in the early 1970s as a permanent component of US foreign policy around the world, has never really been about drugs. What I managed to understand through my own work is the war on drugs, and here I'm just gonna read what I wrote, because I think I will say it better if I just read it. The war on drugs is a toolkit of strategies, resources, technologies, and discourses for the administration of state violence during moments of crisis. Usually is implemented in areas, regions, and against people of the political geography of a given country where the authority of the state and legitimacy of the state, whether it's the national state or an imperial state, has been called into question. So, as a toolkit for the administration of state violence, it's very flexible and malleable and works really well to prepare the soil for regime change against another country. So in this sense, the war on drugs has never been a failure, as we have come to think, because a lot of think tanks and commissions and reports and etc. have said so. And in a sense, it has been, because it hasn't reduced the flow of drugs to the largest market here in the US. But as a toolkit for the administration of state violence, it has been a total success. And Operation Absolute Resolve is proof of that success. So I'm just going to focus on just one particular tool in this toolkit, right? Where we have resources, technologies, discourses, etc. So I'm going to focus on the discourse of the narco, right? That has been abused during all these many months preparing the soil for this operation. Narco regimes, narco terrorists, narco boats, narco this, narco that, right? So, according to the first indictment against Maduro and his collaborators, which was produced in March 2020, that is during Trump's first administration, the indictment states that Maduro and 5 other people, some of them were members of his government, like Diosdado Cabello, his Minister of the Interior, who's still in power in the government of Delcy Rodriguez, and others were members of the dissidents, dissidents groups of the Colombian guerrilla FARC that operate in the binational territory between Colombia and Venezuela. The indictment says this, and here I'm reading a quote. They participated in a corrupt and violent narco-terrorism conspiracy between the Venezuelan Cartel de los Soles and the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, FARC, that prioritized using cocaine as a weapon against America and importing as much cocaine as possible into the United States. So in other words, the label of narco allowed the administration, Trump administration that time, and then again now in the second term, to desensitize the US public opinion to the coming violation of international law that they were preparing on. Because what does this do? And it happened in the case of Panama as well against Noriega. Deploying this discourse, what it does is that justifies the violation of the sovereignty of this country, because the sovereignty of this country is presented as protecting a criminal. We all know that Operation Absolute Resolve was presented in the public sphere of the media here in the US as a law enforcement operation. Therefore, there's no violation of international law or sovereignty, because we just conducted a surgical operation to capture a criminal that has been indicted here. So the problem is that Venezuela is not Panama. Panama has been a dependent country of the United States since its foundation in the early 20th century, when it was created thanks to another imperialist intervention on the part of the US against Colombia, because Panama was part of Colombia. Panama doesn't have a strategic resource like oil. Its strategic value is its location, and obviously the canal that most of it was built with US capitals and money. And Maduro is not Noriega. Noriega controlled a more vertical organization. It was more centralized. What we know of the Maduro regime is that it works in a very federalized way. And it has kind of like branches, and it has branches in every type of economy, legal or illegal. It is a system of extraction of rent, a patronage system that makes money with everything, not just Colombian cocaine, with food, with medicine, with oil, with fuel, you name it, with cattle, you name it. So, and the United States knows this, because in the second indictment, which is the indictment that they submitted once Maduro was captured and was here, brought to the Southern District of New York, the indictment is completely different. Now, we don't see the FARC members there. We see his wife, Celia Flores, as part of the indictment, his son, Nicolás Maduro Jr., also as part of the indictment, which they weren't in the first one. And the idea of the Cartel de los Soles, right, this criminal organization that he led, just vanished from the indictment. It's mentioned once, maybe twice, because they realized that the Cartel de los Soles is not a thing. It's a slang term used in Venezuela to talk about this system of extraction of rents and patronage that has its hands everywhere, from medicine and food to cattle, oil, and Colombian cocaine. So what is next? And what's the whole point now? Well, now we're talking about oil and sometimes about political stability in Venezuela. So the whole discourse of the narco and the whole war on drugs as a toolkit has taken the back seat for now. But Maduro and Celia Flores still have a pending case in New York, so therefore the war on drugs is not dead yet in this particular situation. So we'll see how it's going to be deployed again in the near future.
Really, really helpful to have that, the historical perspective and right up to the moment. In thinking about the war on drugs, which occupies this, almost mythical, very useful, realm of U.S. foreign policy and domestic policy, where do you think that the pardon of Juan Orlando Hernandez fits in, who was the former Honduran president, you all may know, who was convicted in a court of law of having been part of a conspiracy that brought in 400 tons of cocaine, not long before seizing Maduro, the Trump administration, Donald Trump pardoned him. Does that just show the inconsistency?
No, on the contrary, actually, it shows how this is a toolkit for the administration of state violence and has always operated like that, dividing among friends and foes. So the friends are the ones with whom sometimes we even traffic cocaine. Remember the Iran-Contra affair in Central America, in which the South Command in Panama, by the way, the CIA, etc., participated in the trafficking of Colombian cocaine to the United States using Central America. Honduras, by the way, was the rear guard for the Contras. So sometimes the war on drugs is a smokescreen that disguises these other more complex realities and alliances and protect those who are part of those alliances. And sometimes it's weaponized against those who are our enemies, like in the case of Maduro and the regime, and used as a weapon against them. So again, if we stop thinking about the war on drugs as a war against drugs, and we see it as a toolkit for the administration of state violence, in the case of the US, of imperial violence, but in the case of my country, Colombia, the state of Colombia have used it for, internal domination and colonialism against indigenous peoples, Afro-Colombian peoples, etc., right? So it could be any state. So if we look at it that way, we see that is not a contradiction and not even hypocrisy. It's a logical functioning of the strategy.
Thank you for that. And next we have Jim Mahoney, who is a professor of political science and sociology, he's a comparative historical analyst, but earlier in his career, he worked on U.S. foreign policy in Central America.
Thanks. I want to use my 5 minutes to think about U.S. foreign policy and different theories of U.S. foreign policy and how it can help us make sense of the causes and consequences of Operation Absolute Resolve. In terms of the causes of the U.S. action, one thing I would say is it's important to note that the implementation of this operation was actually remarkably successful in the sense that they were able to quickly get Maduro and his spouse and get them out of the country. The details of exactly how this happened, how many people were killed, all of that's still murky. But it's clear that when the Trump administration was considering this operation, this was as good as they could have hoped for. And it easily could have been quite different. This easily could have been some kind of Bay of Pigs disaster where Maduro escaped and we had ongoing conflict. The causes of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America are often thought about in terms of three sets of interests: national security interest, economic interest, and domestic politics. These interests roughly correspond with realist, neo-Marxist, and liberal pluralist theories. And I think one could certainly find evidence that this operation was motivated by these interests, especially national security and maybe especially economic interests. But I think the more important cause was cognitive in nature. And I think it's this conviction that hostile, unfriendly governments in Latin America are unacceptable, and removing them is appropriate and just. And underpinning this conviction is a set of assumptions about Latin American subordination and inferiority. This conviction is rooted in beliefs that the Latin American countries are indebted to the US for keeping Europe out of the region, for spreading successful capitalism and economic opportunities, and for providing a model of a successful country. In his outstanding history of US foreign policy in Latin America, Lars Schultz argues that ideas of US superiority act as the filter through which the US carries out policies toward Latin America. U.S. decision makers pursue security and economic interests, but those interests are expressed through cultural assumptions about Latin America. I think the superiority beliefs that Schultz describes, they declined substantially in the 21st century under the Obama administration, also under the Biden administration. These ideas were on the way out, but they've come back in full force with the Trump administration. This administration, it sees Latin American countries based on the president in power. The U.S. operation in Venezuela, it was not a regime change operation. It was a leader change operation. Its immediate goal was to replace a very unfriendly government with a less unfriendly government. When we develop causal explanations of specific outcomes, social scientists, we try to identify the most important cause. And often many causes are necessary for outcomes. And among the different necessary causes, the most empirically important ones are those that are unusual or atypical. And I think the most important cause of Operation Absolute Resolve was the emergence of this U.S. administration with very old ideas about U.S. superiority and dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Many other conditions were also necessary, but that causal factor stands out because it seemed to be a thing of the past. The emergence of this anachronistic and risk-taking administration is the single most important necessary cause of the operation. Briefly, in terms of the consequences of the operation, if we focus on politics in Venezuela, I think a really good touchstone book is Walter Lefebvre's Inevitable Revolutions, the United States and Central America. In that book, he argues that U.S. interventions caused revolutions in Central America by exasperating inequality, protecting narrow elite interests, backing unpopular governments, supporting repressive factions in the military, and undermining sovereignty. And those are the same mechanisms that seem to be getting activated in Venezuela today. I don't know if the U.S. will continue to work through Rodriguez or if Trump will end up supporting new elections in Machado. She did give him her prize yesterday. Right now, President Rodriguez knows that Trump could promote Machado if she doesn't make the right pro-U.S. gestures. So kind of the issue right now is how much the Trump administration is going to ask of Rodriguez and how far she's willing and able to go in a pro-U.S. direction. And we need to realize that she's surrounded by pro-Maduro hardliners like her brother. So my argument to conclude is that the key ingredients for a future revolution in Venezuela might be emerging: denial of sovereignty, meddling in Venezuelan policymaking, U.S. guardian role, paternalism, tutelage, economic imperialism, dependency, and possibly occupation forces. Those were the very ingredients that fueled revolutions in Central America. I think they could do the same in Venezuela.
That was our upbeat approach and set of conclusions to what might actually turn out. When you look back to other U.S. interventions, particularly if you look at Noriega, if you look at Allende and Arbenz, what do you see as the results of those over time?
The results were inevitably disasters time and time again. This is Lefebvre's point that they bred revolutions in Central America. A number of these governments were progressive, attempting to work on inequality, but that was in the context of the Cold War, where one, I wouldn't make this argument, but one could make the argument that there were strategic interests in protecting the Western Hemisphere against communism. And that kind of narrative is no longer present today. And so it may be the case that U.S. foreign policy still has the same disastrous consequences in Latin America without kind of this justification in terms of national security interests.
Great, thanks for that. And next we have Katrina Kissenbing-Ping, who is an assistant professor of sociology, who is an historical sociologist of race, empire, and citizenship.
Sorry. I think I'm going to kind of like Lena, I'm going to focus on what is old. And I'm going to talk about three things, if I can, in 5 minutes. The first doesn't require much elaboration, and I think Daniel sort of already took us there, which is that the United States has always been an empire state. The second is that debates over foreign interventionism, and specifically the articulation in US nativism, has shaped the forms of US imperialism and the forms that US intervention took over US history. And the last is that although the United States has always been an empire state, imperial state formations change. And we're now seeing, and I think this point has been made by Daniel and Anna already, but that US capitalist, extractive, and military interests are laid bare right now without this veneer of a civilizing or humanitarian or paternalist or democracy building mission, right? That's sort of been stripped away. So I'm going to try to elaborate on these points. I'm going to skip over the US as empire. Happy to talk about it more, but that's just the premise. So even though the US has always been an empire state, there's also been debates about foreign intervention. And they've hinged on these questions and these ideas of inferiority of other people, about whether people from foreign lands could be incorporated and how US laws would apply to these places. So there's been two major positions on this, two ways of thinking about the United States' position in the world and its relationship to foreign and non-white people. And one is of global intervention and strength through rule over subject people. And the second is one of more relative isolationism motivated by nativism and protectionism. So I don't think the United States was ever really an isolationist country, but I think that there have been moves to argue that we should not intervene because we are afraid of what conquering foreign places will mean for the rule of law at home and what it will mean to conquer non-white people, and do we have to give them rights? So the concerns of nativists about what we now call or think of as browning the nation limited and shaped, but didn't stop US intervention. So we could think, for example, in 1893, when white settlers overthrew the Kingdom of Hawaii, the United States didn't want to take it because they were worried about what it meant to take these foreign people. And it wasn't until 1898, when the United States had already required additional lands in the Pacific and the Caribbean, that Hawaii was annexed. And it wasn't until 1959 that Hawaii became a state, right? And so there's this delay that takes place because of this question of race. Of course, the United States has also used other forms of intervention and engaged other kinds of imperialism beyond formal rule. So in the 1900s, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine was used to justify interventions, but not the wholesale annexation or incorporation of Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the DR. So of course, what happened in Hawaii and what happened in these countries that I just mentioned isn't the same thing as what's happening in Venezuela. But my point is that the history of debates about imperialism and isolationism illustrate that, one, in the United States, we have a long history of both imperialism and nativism, and two, that while in the past, this nativist isolationism held imperialism in check, that's no longer true today. So in one party, you see the vitriol for immigrants, for people with TPS status, coupled with US intervention. And so you might wonder why. How did we get to this place where we have both these things in one party? And I think there's a lot to say about that, so I'll try to be brief. But as I mentioned, imperial formations change, and this is related to domestic politics. And so the short story is that how states approach building power changes over time. So recently, for example, we've seen the collapse of a post-World War II order that Daniel mentioned, a return to this, or it laid this kind of bare preference for unilateralism. There's no more facade of civilizing missions, as I mentioned, and there's a disregard for rules at home. It's not just, I mean, Anna mentioned the disregard for international law and international norms, but there's also a disregard for rules at home. And this is the way that, you know, the executive is claiming more power here, the executive branch. So I think some of this can be attributed to living in an increasingly multipolar world. I think some of this has to do with the perception of civilizational decline, and there's concerns about scarcity and who's going to own things. And we can think about this as being in a period of hegemonic decline, and also the lack of domestic industries at home. So you could contrast this with the last 150 years of US history, and I won't talk about it all. But in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, territorial conquest was understood as a way to gain state power, and the US was rising. And then I'm going to skip over to World War II, which was a war of empires. It was a race war. It was a war in which the broad critiques of explicit hierarchical, formal colonial rule grew. and the critiques against racism grew. And in this time, formal empire falls out of favor on the world stage. And the United States is practicing informal empire for this whole time in Latin America as well. And so then in the 20th century, US actors transformed this interventionist project into an informal one, dressed up not in the language of civilizing, but in that of democracy, right? So colonialism becomes anti-communism, becomes anti-terrorism. And in the era of anti-terrorism and anti-communism, the United States, with the help of aid packages, still acted under the pretense of bringing democracy to foreign countries, all in the name of expanding and protecting its sphere of influence. But now, in this era where we don't have USAID, and under the pretense of anti-drugs coupled with anti-terror, we see the capitalist and strategic interests of the United States laid bare. There's no longer the veneer. So and I mean, I think it's interesting too to think about Iraq just for a second, right? So in that case, we just lied. We lied to the UN, right? So we still we're like, oh, we should lie to the UN. Now we don't lie. So I think there's many things to be alarmed at in the Trump administration. And from my vantage point, imperialism, nativism, racism, the pursuit of capital, and military interest and unilateralism aren't new to the United States. But what I find especially worrisome is the way that nativism and imperialism are coupled. It's two ways of thinking about America first, actually, that are coupled in one party. And what does this mean for sovereignty? What does this mean for the rule of law when the sovereign, the one who decides, is Russia, China, the United States, and they decide on their sphere of influence of what sovereignty means for other countries? And in the United States, there's no party with another story of what the United States should be.
It's so interesting to think of territorial conquest as being at the heart of what Trump is up to, and we see it in Greenland, and we've seen it in other places that he's been operating. And then there's the issue of your point about it being so important to one party, and I wonder where it goes from here. Does the pendulum swing? Do you think this is an instinct that is confined to the GOP or a part of the GOP, or in fact, we're in for a long haul of similar adventures?
So before Trump, I used to say that there's two visions of U.S. white hegemony, and one is in the Democratic Party and one is in the Republican Party. And historically, that's been true. The Democratic, well, this is before we think of what the parties are today, but right, the Democratic Party is the nativist isolationist party, and the Republican Party is the imperialist party. And you sort of have them balancing each other. And now, I think for the last at least 20 years, I don't know what the story of the Democrats is. I just think that there's a total failure to have a story that resonates with Americans about what we should be as a nation. And instead, we see both the nativism, the anti-immigrantness, and the hawkish jingoism in the Republican Party. And I don't know what the story of the Democrats should be. So I'm not very hopeful, but that's also just a dispositional problem.
Got it. As they say, time will tell. So our final speaker is Edward Gibson, who's a professor of political science. And after that, we'll go to questions. So be thinking of what you would like to ask each person, and be thinking of directing it at one or two members of the panel. Edward.
Thank you. Well, I think we've heard some really interesting perspectives on U.S. foreign policy towards the region, and the Monroe Doctrine and the Donroe Doctrine. Sorry. So I was going to mention a few things about the Monroe Doctrine, but I'd rather get to Venezuela, since I think we've covered a lot of the general things, and I'll be happy later on to talk more about the Monroe Doctrine and what the the Trump corollary for the Monroe Doctrine. Some of the more educated members of the State Department actually invoke the corollary thing. They don't call it the Donroe Doctrine. But anyway, the key thing here is, having stripped away the liberal vestments of justifications for intervention, we're seeing so far an attempt to give full flower to that doctrine in the intervention in Venezuela. Right now, I think the general view of people supporting the intervention is, well, the strategy seems to make sense. If you think of three stages, we've got one, getting Maduro out, check that Second, stabilization. We have to stabilize the situation. And they've got a strategy, which I'll be getting into, that seems to be already being implemented. So check that. And then in the long run, they're thinking more in terms of the extraction of the oil and the full fulfillment of the Donroe Doctrine, which is basically get foreign interests out of resource extraction and economic activities that are important to the United States. By the way, that goes back to an earlier corollary of the Monroe Doctrine. So it's new, but not new. In fact, it would make some of those people blush in its sort of non-liberal trappings. So we'll get the Chinese out, and we'll restructure the Venezuelan oil industry in a way that makes the U.S. once again the main customer and the whole system oriented towards that objective. But we don't have to worry about regime change. The only problem with that logic is that we already started changing the regime. The intervention means, fundamentally, we've gone in there, and we've extracted the president, and we said, now we're going to run Venezuela and dominate it. So what we've done is injected tremendous volatility into the complex system of alliances that held that authoritarian regime together, and also the relationship between government and opposition. So in these 5 minutes, I just want to look at this from the perspective of an old scholar of comparative democratization and transitions from authoritarian rule, and see what insights we can get. I mean, who are the main actors now that we're dealing with as we want to stabilize Venezuela? One, well, let's look at the regime itself, or the authoritarian coalition. And remember some of these names because they're going to be important in the future. But one that we're familiar with by now is Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president and acting president of Venezuela now, while she, her brother, and a number of other people representing the sort of the political wing of the Chavista movement and the Chavista regime. They tend to control politics through the sham elections and through the sort of regime, typical regime institutions. Beyond that, we have two other key actors: the security services and the forces of internal coercion. The official security services, but also the vast paramilitary organizations that are decentralized, famously known as the colectivos, that usually respond to the regime in their enforcement of discipline. And third, we have the armed forces, the professional armed forces. The security system is run by a man called Diosdado Cabello. Diosdado, I always thought that was ironic. It means God-given, but take what you will from that. He's a long-standing Chavista. He's viewed as the hardliner. Usually when we look at these sorts of arrangements with an authoritarian coalition, we think of hardliners and softliners, and very much identified as the hardliner in this whole game of regime change and what's going to happen to the regime. And within the armed forces, we have being led by a general called Padrino Lopez. Padrino. I kept saying patron. Padrino Lopez, who is a long-standing senior official of the military, rose up through the ranks, was trained at the School of the Americas in the United States before the emergence of Chavez, which means to many people in the Trump administration, he's probably been socialized at a key point in his career and probably is a pragmatic individual. Even though he is a real Chavista loyalist and ideologue. He saved Chavez during the 2002 coup that overthrew him, and he kept the armed forces loyal to Chavez throughout that. So we have the political wing, we have the internal coercive wing, the security services, and we have the armed forces. These are the three sort of groups of actors that the United States thinks that it can more or less manipulate and play with. The key thing here is to have a cooperative Delcy Rodriguez, count on the pragmatic members of the Chavista coalition. Maduro, by the way, I think is disposable. He was president, but this is really a Chavista regime. People call it the Maduro regime, but it's the regime that Chavez built and it then morphed into more of a hardline authoritarian regime when originally it had some sort of promises of sort of populist democracy and populist sovereignty and all of that. But that is long gone now. Maduro, so therefore, I think you can count him out of the picture, and we're looking at these these centers of power that are continuous with the past. And I was reading a document by one of these think tanks that's trying to get the ear of Donald Trump, and their recipe was, you're doing very well so far. Delcy Rodriguez is a technocrat. She's pragmatic. She'll negotiate, because the one thing that unites all three of these different groups is they do not want democratization. They want a preservation of the authoritarian regime, and therefore they may be willing to negotiate a way to stay in power and prevent the emergence of a real alternative. But you've got to corral this guy in the Interior Ministry, Diosdado Cabello, and find a way, because he's the sort of, not the fly in the ointment, but he's the hardliner. He's the one we have to watch out for. He actually has a TV program, but here I'm going to start digressing. But he has a weekly TV program. You may have heard of Hugo Chavez's TV program in the old days, Aló Presidente, which was a very upbeat kind of show every Sunday. Diosdado has a weekly TV show called Diosdado Dándole con el Mazo, wielding the club, smashing with the club, hitting with the club, bringing the hammer down. There's many translations where he denounces opponents of the regime, and the next morning through Operation Knock Knock, which he also kind of came up with, the security services are knocking on their doors and dragging them into the big prison that they built. So the hopes, therefore, that you can negotiate with the military, and that maybe over the long term, those will be the main sources of power. And then at a key moment of stabilization, you go take out Diosdado Cabello. Now the opposition, because this is the real problem Trump has. Maria Machado is a big problem for Donald Trump and the execution of the Don Road Doctrine in Venezuela. Why? Because she has incredible international recognition now, and also within Venezuelan politics. She has had an unlikely emergence. For a long time, she was a very marginal figure. She was the intransigent one, the one that refused to negotiate, the very ideological one. She incarnates everything that Chavismo hates, and she hates everything about Chavismo, and she's also hated by the Chavista upper brass. But she's also the principled one, and she has her Nobel Peace Prize. Well, Donald has it now, but she's been awarded it. The big problem for Donald Trump is that he does not want her anywhere near this game, because really introducing a Machadoista, movement or element to this whole process does risk a flare-up of civil war and civil conflict, because she's hated by the Chavistas. Things are very polarized. It's best just to keep her out of the scene and move more towards the strategy of, if they're going to accept the fact that they have to change the regime, move it more towards the sort of scenario of a liberalized autocracy. Right now, they've already started. One step in any liberalized autocracy or liberalization is release of political prisoners. I think they've released so far about 62, 63, 64. Cabello keeps, paring down that list. Also, you would have a system where you sort of open the economy up a little bit, bring business back into the coalition, and they would be very happy with a status quo that actually has more business opportunities. I'm talking about Venezuelan business too. Sort of move towards that sort of arrangement where bit by bit more pragmatic sectors of the opposition can be brought into the liberalized autocracy and could be pretty happy sharing in the spoils. Because Venezuela has a long tradition of spoils sharing. And this is the last point I'll make, because it refers also to Machado. Hugo Chavez in 1998 began the overthrow and the dismantling of a liberal democracy. But that liberal democracy was a party cartel, a gigantic party cartel fueled by oil that they distributed to a vast variety of constituencies that went way all down, the social totem pole. So starting with businesses that got enriched by subsidies from oil, the army, the armed forces, universities, student groups, local neighborhood soccer teams. They all had the names of the political parties that were supporting them. It was a society that was deeply connected to this party cartel. And if you were connected to that, if you were a member of an institution that benefited from the system, you did well. And the problem was, though, that this only covered a little less than half the population. The rest of the population lived in that world of informality and marginalization that we associate quite often with Latin America. And that was the system that Hugo Chavez overthrew. He had a strange sort of system of socialism or redistribution where he viewed the origin of all ills as this kind of liberal democracy that tends to appropriate the fruits of wealth for itself. And he supplanted it with what he viewed as a populist democracy, shed of the inconveniences of liberal protections for people like those in the old order. And Machado herself comes from the core of that old order. Her intransigence is linked to her own origins. Her parents were owners of steel companies, and if you were the owner of a steel company, you were really plugged in, because that was the core of the developmentalist objectives: steel, heavy industries, aluminum. And they enriched themselves in that big party cartel system from which she comes, and wants to restore, at least in terms of the systems of privilege that were associated with it. The rest of the opposition tended to be much more pragmatic, and over the years, they even acknowledged. We had Enrique Capriles come to Chicago several times. He was until 2014, he was pretty much the leader of the opposition, who would admit openly, you know, the old days of the punto fijo political order, they're gone. We have to generate something new that incorporates the best of what Chavez has done and introduce more liberalism and more liberal protections to the new order that we build. Machado has always been no to Chavismo in all its forms, and basically thermidor, basically restoration of an old order that preceded it. That's why Donald Trump does not want her near this whole thing. It would turn a nice sort of stable autocracy that she would oppose, and so would her followers.
Thanks for the tutorial on Venezuela, and I will ask only a rhetorical question because I want to get to everyone else's questions. But one has to ask, given the United States' experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, how much understanding there is in this country, in the administration, about all of those different pieces. So questions from y'all. I think I'll just let the person with the microphone go ahead and circulate and choose people.
Thanks to everybody for the wonderful clarity. There's one thing I can't quite figure out, and sorry for the indelicacy, but why the extraction, why not missiles or drones, right? Professor Mahoney, maybe you can say something about this. You said that it was an incredible risk in the operation that was taken, right? You know, one thinks about that Black Hawk that went down in Mogadishu in 93, I think, and the extraction of that, the loss of life, the political consequences, something like that must have been on the table for the deciders, right? And on the other hand, must have been something like what happened in Iran last year, right? Midnight Hammer, or something like what happened to Qasem Soleimani, right? It's, I mean, sorry for the cynicism, but option number two seems like less risk for the decider. Why would the other option be preferred?
And let me also intercede here, and Jim, go ahead and ask that, answer that. Let's try to keep questions and answers short, just so we can get more things going.
I'm not certain of the answer, but I think they had some really good intelligence that this would likely succeed. You know, the details are still murky, but they had some inside information and had to be very confident that this was going to work, because the consequences of a blunder would, you know, we would be talking about a very different situation in Venezuela now. So I think they had confidence that it would work.
Thank you. So in the past few days, various American oil executives have claimed that they don't have any particular interest in large-scale investment in Venezuela in the short term, cited the country as uninvestable due, besides the low quality of the crude oil being collected, to a dangerous legal and economic environment. If the Trump administration's plan is to maintain the Rodriguez administration in the long term, is it possible for internal reform to occur to the point that it would entice American oil to enter the country at all? Is that a foreseeable option, or would that require broader regime change? And that's for anyone who.
Yeah, good thought. Who would like to take that one on?
So I think the complete picture includes Guyana, just because of the oil reserves that were discovered there a little bit more than a decade ago. And ExxonMobil has been working on those oil reserves. So there's definitely kind of like a competition between Exxon and Chevron, because Chevron is in Venezuela and Exxon is in Guyana. And let's remember that one of the last things that Maduro did with the electoral system in Bogotá, in Caracas, in Venezuela, was to call for a referendum about what to do with the Essequibo, which is the border region between Venezuela and Guyana, where all these oil reserves, this new discovery is located, in addition to rare minerals and other resources. So I don't have an answer for your specific question, but what I understand is that it's not just about Venezuela's oil reserves, it's about the triangle that is in that region between, Venezuela and the waters of Venezuela, but also the Essequibo region in Guyana, and Maduro's last idea of annexing that region. So we don't know if Delcy Rodriguez is going to continue with the plan of annexing the Essequibo or not. So there's a lot of unanswered questions there, and that the exploitation of oil depends on answering those political questions.
Good. I think that regime change in the short run would actually scare the oil companies even more, both because of the instability that it might create generally, but also because it might reignite debates about the oil industry within Venezuela. I mean, Venezuelans are very proud of the nationalizations that took place in the 1970s. They were peaceful nationalizations. They created probably one of the most effective and efficient state-owned oil companies in the world. And it was actually a source of pride both for pro-regime and anti-regime individuals. So the issue of who owns the oil, which, by the way, Venezuelans own the oil when it's down there. It's more the infrastructure that, but Trump keeps saying it's our oil. So therefore, I do think that's why they're going to stick to the strategy of a very slow change, focus on stability. And that might provide more assurances to the oil companies that if they could have a year or two of stability, they might be able to actually invest in there and rebuild some of the oil infrastructure, mainly coerced to go in there and do that, because they've got enough oil everywhere else.
Thank you. Thank you all for your interventions. So I have a very general question and a short one. And I'm thinking in terms of the Latin American, so Ana, Lina, Jim, Ed, but I think anyone can jump in. I'm just interested, the United States has a very long history within the hemisphere, within Latin America, in terms of interventions, but also in terms of support. So I think you'd say, like, after independence, from that period to now, there are warm and fuzzy feelings and very negative, right, antagonistic feelings, depending on where you sit on the political map, where you sit on the end of interventions, and a number of other factors. So I'm interested in what your sense is about the response in Latin America from different states, but also from its populations. I'm guessing that it's going to be impossible to generalize one, right, position. So I'm interested in what positions particularly stood out to you, whether it be Petro or Milei or the governor of Peru, or however you'd like to frame it. Thanks.
Ana, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting actually to see the reactions of some political parties. So a lot of the right-wing political parties have been even pushing for this, have celebrated it. Some have even pushed for a similar attack on their own countries to remove a regime that they don't like. So I think there is a lot of division in how political parties, especially given this polarization, how they see the intervention. I think maybe there is a myopic analysis of the situation, just thinking of removing a left-wing regime and not thinking of all the other consequences for the region. I think there has been a strong and kind of unified reaction by civil society organizations, especially the ones that work on human rights. They put together a statement that was signed, I think, by 18 NGOs in the region, with a lot of emphasis on the importance of pushing back and demanding that all countries follow international law, and trying to sort of raise the alarms about what this means for Latin America. I think for the population at large, I also think there is divisions. I don't think there is one clear response. And I think, and I think we haven't talked a lot about that, but within Venezuela, and especially within the diaspora from Venezuela, there is a lot of support so far for the intervention. I think it may be waning down as days go by, but at the beginning, no? And so I think anti-Maduro and anti-Chavismo sectors of the population in different countries were also happy at the beginning. We'll see what happens later on once we see, the instability that this may bring to Venezuela. Because in a more pragmatic sense, the exodus of Venezuelans because of the Maduro regime has affected a lot of the Latin American countries as well, right? 6 million people or 8 million people. So I think it's not unified.
I think the only thing to add will be that what will happen in Colombia this year, it will be perhaps the most consequential political situation that will have impacts, because the legal and illegal economies of the border region between the two countries are completely intertwined, and that is from the Caribbean to the Amazon region, so including inland. Yesterday, precisely, I was talking to one of the researchers from the crisis group that living in Bogotá has been doing research about these different sections of the border region. And all legal and illegal economies are completely intertwined. And the contradictions and the unresolved issues of the internal armed conflict in Colombia have spilled all over Venezuela, and part of the tremendous plurality of armed actors operating now in Venezuela had to do with that spillover of the Colombian conflict over Venezuela, right? That has been used as a rear guard, as a vanguard, like in different ways. So what will happen in Colombia this year, which is the election of a new president, is perhaps kind of like that will have the larger impact, because it will be a direct impact. And we know that right-wing forces in Colombia have been working really, really hard to close ranks with Trump, coming here, visiting him, having private meetings, trying to steer the wheel for the Trump administration to support them and to be back in power.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, do you have a thought? Do you have a quick thought?
Real quick thought, it's
Sure.
that it's surprising how the left wing is afraid to speak out because of Trump, and the right wing's very eager to kiss up to Trump. We're in a different kind of international regime where Latin American countries are dealing with Donald Trump as the representative of the US.
It's going to be so interesting to see if the pendulum swings at the next election or down the road, too. One more question? Do we have one?
Hi,
Oh,
thank
hi.
you. I think it's a similar question still in that thing on how, a lot of countries in Latin America are worried that, this opens doors to more intervention in them. For example, we know that Trump has had eyes on the Amazon rainforest, like the Brazilian part, for a while. And if there's any thoughts on anything like that happening to other countries too? Whoever wants to answer.
I would only say that the one thing that we've not talked that much about is the growing role of China in a number of countries, supplanting the United States in a number of countries as the main importer of whatever these countries are producing, usually minerals. And that leaves wide open areas of intervention that Trump might choose. I mean, I think they've got their hands kind of full right now. But there is a strategy, if there is going to be consistency in the implementation of this new sort of quasi-doctrine, a lot of it will involve sort of pushing back on China's expansion in Latin America, which has been dramatic over the last 20 years. To the point where even some, I mean, I know there's debates in Chile right now about the fact that their number one customer for minerals is China, and worries about growing dependence. Even Venezuela has a $60 billion debt from loans, which are being repaid with oil. And so Venezuela got caught in a trap there of their own making, of basically having to divert a big chunk of their dwindling oil exports to repay debts rather than to get new revenue. So what will be interesting, we'll see if there's new activism on Trump's part on that issue, the extent to which that could shake things up in terms of local debates and local conflicts, and who knows what could happen there.
So I'd like to wrap up by thanking all of you. I feel so much smarter, and I know everybody else here does too. I'm currently, as some of you know, I'm currently teaching a class in international studies and American studies in Medill, cross-listed on called Dilemmas of American Power, and I kind of wish I could bottle the wisdom and creative thinking on this stage and carry it into class. But I very much want to thank Deborah Cohen and Jorge for putting this together, and the fabulous Buffett staff for making it all so smooth. Thanks for coming.